tie it up.
I blow dried it.
What? Oh, damn.
Very fancy.
I went to your office by like 5 when you were in there, so I was
Did you knock?
like, I didn't hear any noise.
Oh, because I was there. I was just,
You were?
I was just having supper very silently and sadly alone.
And when it's empty, you don't make a scene.
Oh, it's fun, but you could next time knock. Sometimes I'm there and I just don't do much. Yeah,
It was just too silent. So in there.
I'm sorry.
You're a quiet eater.
Yeah, apparently. Also, my office is like disturbingly large for just one person. It's just so it's yeah, because from the door I would sit about where Annalie is right now, so you wouldn't have heard much anyway, even if I. I'm opening up the PowerPoint just to have like a reference, but obviously it's not going to be that that hard and fast. I think today, just so I know two things. So, first of all, I assume if you wanted to ask me, Abube, about your essays, you all saw that I put the grades up and all of that, the comments. Okay, good. If you do have questions or concerns, yeah, again, happy either right after class today, during the break, whatever. Feel absolutely free, but generally, I think most people, going off the top of my head, improved. So no worries on that front.
I have a question.
Yep.
On the main page, you wrote, I understand that you ... and
Did I forget to finish that sentence?
that's it.
Oh, no. Okay, well.
Either that or the computer cut you off.
Oh, that might have been.
Are you sure? Because when I log in on my computer, I can't see his comments at all. But when
Really?
I log in on my phone, I can see it all.
Oh.
I tried both. It's
Okay.
not on your comments on the PDF. It's on the main
Yeah.
portal page.
Huh. Okay, well, I'll check that in a minute. But I think what I was going for from yours was like that you had to cut in certain places. So I wouldn't. Yeah, I'll think about it and look back on what's missing from my comment. Yes.
Yeah, well, mine is just because I think I keep getting the same comments. It was mostly said that I could have used most of them to write the whole essay.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It was too much. I made too much point.
Yeah, so usually when I say that, I mean in the sense that each of your individual paragraphs could have been blown out into its full essay, right? In that sense. And usually I mention that when you talk about, and when I say you're not the only one to whom I said this, by the way. I'm saying you because you're the one who asked the question. Is because you mentioned what could be a rather broad point and don't go into it in enough depth, right? And that's what I mean by
I guess
you could
I
have blown
understood
it out.
that because
Yeah.
I lost my old essay. I deleted it.
Oh no.
I was about to hand it by like 9, and then like I did Word didn't save it automatically.
Yeah.
And came back. I didn't see it anymore, so I had to redo it. And
Okay. Well, look. From what I remember, you as well, Abube, your ideas are very good. I'm just asking you to go into like more depth into it. Yeah. So my second question, and then as I'm pulling up Mel, your essay. How many of you finished the Marrow Thieves? Finished? You finished it? Most of it?
I got almost to part 2.
Almost to part 2. Like halfway through, you mean? Or chapter 2?
Like story part 2 and chapters part it.
Story part 2. Okay.
Yes.
So it's a little bit further.
Haunted in the bush.
Haunted in the bush. Okay. Hi. Hello.
That's where I lived. So I guess not that far.
No. Okay. So other Indians. Okay. Well, Ayad, how far away did you get in the Marrow Thieves? Okay. Story part 2.
Probably not too far.
So, a couple people who finished it. So we'll see how the discussion goes. I do have, as you see here, some things that I want to discuss, namely questions of genre and utopia. utopia, dystopia.
If only.
Yeah, exactly. If only. And questions on the young adult fiction genre, which I don't think is exclusive to the contemporary literary scene, but has certainly seen an explosion in contemporary literature as we're understanding it in this class, which is in part why I wanted to talk about a book like this, because while some of the themes that we've discussed in class before are recurring, the actual approach is one that I think is worth unpacking, right? Why Dimaline, I keep calling her Dimaline, and then I listened to an interview with her and she pronounces it Dimaline, so I need to train myself to pronounce her name properly. But I think there's a reason why she chose to write it in this particular form, because she has written more adult and literary fiction as well. So it's a choice on some level. No, for me, the entire comment here, so you can come see me at the break and I'll show you. Hi, Billy, bud.
Hello.
All right. Did you finish the Marrow Thieves?
Adventure. I got to page 170.
Good enough. Okay.
How many pages are there?
220 something.
It's all skewed in the book.
Yeah, 234. Oh no, sorry, that's with the acknowledgments. So 230. 230. Yeah. Okay, so depending on how the conversation goes today, since a lot of you read about halfway through, we might just separate it up between today and tomorrow. We'll see if we have anything left to unpack at the end of today's class that might be worth talking about in that sense. If by the end of today's class we realize, or I realize, that there wouldn't be much added in talking about it for like a second full class, we might just go into Obasan directly. Okay. All right. So last week we left off with a brief discussion on the young adult genre, because, at least technically speaking, parts of Split Tooth, or Split Tooth as a piece in its entirety, can be considered a young adult work. Right? It has some of its tropes, even if it distorts them in various ways. What do we remember as quintessential parts of young adult fiction?
The rites of passage.
I was wondering which rights you were going to finish with.
The rights of women.
Yeah, exactly. So rites of passage. I have room to finish it.
Is coming of age the same as that or different? Coming of age.
We can maybe have a discussion, but we can qualify it as coming of age. I'm sure some pedantic scholar somewhere would distinguish between the two. I think for our purposes here, we can pretty much put them into the same category. What else was other stuff that we consider to be part of young adult fiction?
The protagonist is a child. 11.
Right. So the young adult part extends not just to who the audience is, but who the protagonists are. Protagonists are...
That really skews stuff, though, because you got works that are about really, really, really intense stuff that are about kids as protagonists, and that's...
Such as this, for example, right? Which we'll talk about, right? Where that line kind of lies between starring children as young adult fiction and being addressed for children. Okay? Yes, you had your hand up. Sorry, I didn't hear that last part.
And why schools are important.
So You're talking about this book or young adult fiction in general?
No, this book.
Okay. I will say, as a more general thing about young adult fiction, the role of education does play a significant role in a lot of them, right? Here it is formalized education, right? That kind of blurring of what we consider to be formal education, informal education, obviously historical uses of residential schools and speculative use of their return plays a huge part in it. But even on a more metaphorical level, and we can tie this into the coming of age or rites of passage section that we put up, the way that children or teenagers learn to be a part of the world is an essential part of a lot of young adult fiction. Good. Is there anything else? Oh yeah, there's one huge one that we didn't bring up that I think is rather helpful, especially for how characters act in the Marrow Thieves, or how certain characters act, I should say. We brought it up last week as love triangles being a huge part of a lot of young adult fiction. But as I was mentioning earlier, I listened to a brief 5-minute interview that Dimaline did with CBC when this was getting airtime on Canada Reads, right? The competition that happens every year on the CBC. And they were interviewing her very briefly about what the book is about and why it's important and so on and so forth. And one of the questions was, how does she distinguish between young adult fiction and regular literary fiction, for example, right? Quote unquote adult fiction. And for her, she had a very simple answer, and I wrote it down. I'll extend it out from love triangles. For her, when she's writing young adult fiction, it's all emotion, right? It's impulse, it's heart first, as she said. Whereas in literary fiction, and you can really compare any other piece of fiction that we've talked about in this class, the characters contemplate, and they can wonder, and they talk about things because they're adults, and they can do that, or they know the value of doing that, right? And I'm comfortable saying this because none of you are part of that category, but teenagers are stupid sometimes, right? I say that as a former teenager, and you probably know that as former teenagers as well, right? Teenagers often act first and then ask questions later or talk about it later. And when you're telling a story, that can be rather interesting, right? Because then you have to set up situations where characters need to work their way out of the mess that they themselves made, right? Or that they ended up in because of their impulsiveness. If that were the case in the wars, for example, it would have been a very short story and Robert would have probably been shot within the first 20 pages. Right? So, not necessarily as interesting. So yes, that ties into the love triangles element of it, but also on an overall element of acting impulsively. The other thing that she mentioned that she thought was funny is that in YA, this has nothing to do very much with today, but in YA, she talks about love, whereas in her adult fiction, she can talk about sex. And I thought that was just a funny distinction that she made between the two.
At least in more detail.
In more detail, yes. When she was talking about sex, she meant like explicitly. So I've never actually read any of her literary fiction, so I can't confirm or deny to what extent she does that in her other stuff. Okay. Just looking at my notes to make sure I'm not forgetting anything about young adult fiction.
I don't think Katniss was impulsive. I think she was calculating.
I've never read the Hunger Games, so I couldn't say.
Yeah,
but again, I'm telling you what she
Oh, YA dystopian fiction.
Yeah, right. I'm sure I've heard it's quite good. I have nothing against it on principle. I've just never taken the time to read
It's very wide.
it. But yeah, what was I going to say? Yeah, I'm sure there's some variations on this idea. I'm just telling you what Dimaline's perspective on it was. Hi, Louise. What happened?
My foot got ran over.
Oh,
Nothing's broken though. It's just I'm bruised and sore.
no kidding. I'm shocked that it's only bruised. I feel like I would have crumbled under the weight of that card. Okay. So, yeah, one of the things, I guess, I wrote dystopia and young adults, but we kind of reversed it. One of the things that we discussed last week, very briefly, or that I raised as something that you should pay attention to or maybe think about, is that young adult fiction often gets a bad rap, right? We gave the example of Twilight, right, as being perhaps unjustly maligned by critics and society. You, Mel, had raised the point of it being specifically targeted to young girls, right, and that probably didn't help. But overall, you see that in literary circles, especially, that young adult fiction is really dunked upon as a bad type of fiction. To take another example, you see this a lot for other reasons, but you're seeing a revitalization on the criticism of the Harry Potter series of books, for example. Part of that is because of J.K. Rowling as a person, but even before all of that discussion came out, you saw a kind of reconsideration as to whether or not those books were really good literature, so to speak. Now, I guess we can start by asking the question, are we good if I erase this? Is it fair to give young adult fiction a bad rap? If so, why? If not, what purpose does it serve then in fiction, right? And especially in contemporary fiction, if not? And I want to use this as a way to segue more into the discussion of what the book actually does and how it doesn't. Now, this is not me forcing you to like this book. If you didn't like this book, that's okay, right? I'm not the arbiter of taste, as I've mentioned before. But I do think it's necessary to consider why an author chose a particular style of writing, right? In that sense. Okay? Because Dimaline and others that we've talked about in this class choose their style. Right? They have all systematically written other modes, so they are able to do it. So there is that consideration to take up, and it is something that you can do in your own essays, by the way, as to why Dimaline chose to write a residential school speculative fiction YA. Because on the surface, it doesn't sound like the type of thing that you would necessarily address through a YA perspective. Right? Thematically, it's pretty horrifying. So why do that? So I guess we can call this segment young adult, just good or bad. So why might we consider, I guess, young adult, let's start with the bad. Why might we consider it lesser than or less important, less artistic, literary, with a capital L?
Tends to be more simplified and a lower grade level of reading.
Okay.
Which is intentional, of course, because they're aiming at a certain audience. But if you're looking for something complex that you as an adult is going to challenge you, then you wouldn't necessarily enjoy it.
Sure. So there tends to be this perspective that because it's for young adults or for children, right? Or what people perceive to be children, then it's immediately less interesting. Dimaline herself in that same interview, I'm just going off of that, kind of disagrees with that perspective. She's rather explicit that she thinks children and teenagers are very smart and capable on their own, right? Despite the joke that I made earlier that teenagers are stupid. But in the sense that she doesn't necessarily change the level of writing that she's talking about, right? She changes her approach, but not necessarily the prose style. So one might wonder if this is a perception or a reality. Probably it changes from one author to another. But I think you're certainly right that overall we tend to associate YA fiction with this kind of simplified prose, or even stories, period. What else, if anything, might we enter into the bad category, or less interesting category of adult fiction?
I think it's good, no bad. So I think it's good because like there's a lot of movies you want to do.
Okay. So that's a genre that you tend to read overall?
I read a lot. I read like romance and YA.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I have a lot of movies.
Right, so you tend to think that it emphasizes community a little bit more than...
Yeah, because they're like 21, and I don't think 21-year-olds are figured out.
That's true. I think that's a valid point, right? It tends to talk about this moment, or the characters in YA tend to be at a stage where they're looking for their own community, right? In the Marrow Thieves, it's quite literalized, okay? But it can be metaphorical as well, and that can be a very interesting thing to discuss and unpack, right? What does it mean to have a sense of community? Because we tend to think of it in traditional terms often, right? My community are my friends and family, right? That I've made a long time ago. And at least speaking for myself, they absolutely are. But we can maybe expand that out. Yeah.
I think it also shows like a little bit of like a moral lesson on as they grow as they go from their bad decisions.
Interesting. I'll put morals on the cusp there. For you, I think it's good. I think, at least speaking to other people, sometimes, especially adults, find it pedantic, right? And often the way that those morals are brought up seems forced and kind of simplified in that sense. If that's something you like, I'm not dunking on it, but that's why I'm putting it kind of in the middle, because it can kind of go both ways, I think, depending on who you ask. Yeah.
I just have like a general question
Sure.
for a second. Like when I was in elementary, like I remember like the library would always send like the stronger readers like to look more in depth in a chapter book to a young adult. But like what's the difference from that to someone that just already that like wants like just a young adult book?
So you're kind of preempting what we're leading up to.
Oh,
no, it's fine. Might as well talk about it now. Is that ultimately these distinctions are somewhat arbitrary, right? And part of my point when considering categories like young adult, right, is that it is a relatively recent phenomenon as far as literary categories are concerned. I could look this up, but I would bet honestly my bottom dollar that this emerged in the maybe late 80s, early 90s as a category. It's pretty recent as far as literature is concerned. And I think one of the main differences is that we've also created societally the category of the teenager, right? And that's what they're meant for, right? Not quite children, but not quite adults yet. Right? So that's, I guess, the simple way of answering that question to me. I'm sure someone who's more adept at like the ins and outs of YA fiction might disagree with me, but that's how I understand it.
The whole concept of children's literature in general is a very recent
Yeah,
development. So it makes sense that it would just keep evolving.
yeah, absolutely. Although children's literature, right, to use the example of the wars that we talked about, G.H. Hendy, right, was a child's writer or a children's book writer in the 19th century, and that's kind of when that emerged. So the young adult idea came a little bit later. Just for those of you who don't know, even the very idea of us discussing teenagers as a social category and as a familial category really emerged after the 1950s. Right? It is surprisingly recent. Before that, you were just a child or an adult. People had very little distinctions between the two. One of the ways that people also frame it, which gets at the arbitrariness of a lot of these categories, is this idea of high art versus low art. And a lot of people will tend to place young adult fiction into low art. Now, if you often ask people what exactly low art is, then suddenly it gets kind of dicey and people will tend to kind of fumble over themselves. And it often comes down to elitism versus, more popular type of fiction. I'm thinking of our brief tangent. I think it was last week, sometime when we were talking about the Beatles, right? At the time when the Beatles were coming out, they were considered, right, low art, certainly, right? Oh, this is not Beethoven, for example. And it isn't, that's true. But people used that comparison to diminish what rock and roll was. Right? Whereas today, what used to be considered low art in the Beatles, if you compare it to, I don't know what a modern rock band is. It's not modern, but let's say Pearl Jam, for example. Right, where people would say, oh, Beatles are the high art to Nirvana or Pearl Jam's low art. Right, so the categories kind of shift over time. I'm taking a really random example, but that's kind of how these categories are ultimately rather time specific, right, and socially specific. Yeah, go ahead.
It's just a question I have.
Mhm.
What differentiates a TV show from a YA adult? Because some of them don't have the same tag.
I personally don't distinguish between the two, but I actually don't know what would be the difference between teen and young adult at that point. For me, young adult is a teen. Yeah. Maybe, do you have a different answer, genuinely?
No, I was asking.
Yeah.
I was confused.
To me, it's the same thing, right? I think publishers tend to use young adult as a category because it sounds a little bit more elevated than teenager. I think it's just a marketing thing at the end of the day, but I could be entirely wrong on that. Maybe someone has a different version, but for me, in my mind, it's a marketing thing. But yeah, even within the same categories, comic books, for example, we keep coming back to those examples because it's quite easy, right? But for every Superman comic, which a lot of people would consider low art, right? It's published on a monthly basis and they're very disposable, right? There is a comic book that's considered high art, right? Mouse. Alan Moore's Watchmen, whatever, right? So even within, right, the same medium, we can very much find some discussion and controversy, I guess, as to what is considered what.
So would you say the rate at which it's produced is also a big factor in whether it's considered YA?
I would think so, absolutely. How many YA books are published every year?
I mean, how many romances are published
right.
every year?
And a lot of people, I think, would put romances, especially like the new wave of fantasy romances that are coming out, which I heard some of them are pretty good. I don't know. I haven't opened one of them, so maybe one of you have read them and can tell me whether they're good or not. But right, I think the speed at which they're published and pumped out does give a sense that the quality is lesser as a result. Right, and you can think of this for clothes, for example. Right, if you say to someone, "Oh, my T-shirt was made on a factory line, right, for the Walmart brand," it's going to have a connotation of being of lesser quality or of lesser value, right, lower than if it was handmade, even if it's the same two pieces of fabric that are stuck together. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It's a bigger slave labor.
Bigger slave labor. Yeah, you can get into like all of that discussion, of course. Actually, it adds to it, right? Because the slave labor or the unpaid labor or low paid labor will make it so that the workers are less skilled, right? In that sense, whereas someone who made your T-shirt by hand technically has, right, a more proficient skill in that. So it comes down to a similar thing. Now, whether we would actually place Dimaline's novel into high art or low art can be a discussion that we have, because some people insist on those categories, right? The Wars and Angelique is high art. This would be low art, for example, because it's part of this mass-produced phenomenon of targeting teenagers, and it's meant to sell by the millions. And indeed it did. I don't know if it sold by the millions, but it sold like gangbusters, right? So maybe we can get into that. But personally, at least speaking for myself, I think the prose, even if the production might be low art, the prose certainly doesn't lend itself to that, I think. I think there's some really interesting moments in the text. I know you said you when we were last talking, you said you didn't like the prose as much. But I think reading some of these passages, there's a quality to the writing that elevates it above some of the other young adult fiction that I've read, for example, which wouldn't place it in the arbitrary low art category.
I'm not here to yuck anyone's yell.
No, it's fine. I'm just saying that I'm expressing, right, what I consider to be the differences between this and what would be typically considered low art. I put dystopia in a similar slide, or in the same slide, for two reasons. One, because it's inherently part of the genre of this book, and we should talk about it. But also because it's a pretty good segue, I guess. Because you'll notice that a lot of young adult fiction also happens to be dystopia as well. Right? Or at least the popular ones that I'm aware of seem to be dystopic. And it would be worth unpacking why that is.
I would like to challenge the idea that this book is a dystopia, actually.
Okay.
Because I would say that it's post-apocalyptic or speculative. But with dystopia, it's got to show some aspect of the future that looks like a utopia, and then you find the bad in it. Like, even the Hunger Games, it starts in the outer rims where life is pretty shitty,
Right.
but there's the capital where they're living large and fancy. And so even though it's coming from Katniss' perspective and you're like, oh, this is terrible, there is a glimpse of this amazing fancy life that some people get to live off the backs of others. Whereas in this one, yes, the white people are stealing the Marrow from the indigenous people, but there's no sign that they're living a good, comfortable life anywhere. Just they're not being pursued for their bone marrow, but they're also all suffering this like mass psychosis. So no part of this seems like a utopia to me.
So for you, a dystopia necessarily needs a dystopia within the world itself.
Isn't that the point?
That's interesting. I've always considered it
utopia. A distorted utopia.
So technically, I can understand why that connection is made, right? The distortion of utopia. Technically, dystopia is just the opposite of a utopia.
So just bad.
Just bad, right? But I like that idea, though, that
Because
Do you
even
have
in
an
the
example,
Handmaid's
by the way,
Tale,
of a yeah, okay.
in the Handmaid's Tale, it seems, I mean, to our sensibilities, just very bad all around. But
Yeah.
there is like a fundamentalist Christian aspect to it, where like the commander is happy about the way things are, right? He has all the power.
I wouldn't even know. I haven't read a Handmaid's Tale in too long enough to kind of make that argument. I don't remember him as being entirely happy.
Okay, not happy. Okay, not happy. That's not the right word. But he is powerful, and he is creating the world that he wants because he has so much power.
Right. I guess that's the advantage of having seen the TV show as well, is that it kind of expands on that, but we can stick to the book. But yeah. But I think that's a good question. I think the way I was operating and creating this slide and thinking about...
I know it's touted as a dystopia.
Yeah. I think maybe other people can join in as well if they have a different perspective on what dystopia is. I tend to think of it as just a non-utopia, right? So it doesn't have to be post-apocalyptic, right? Yeah,
No,
there's
dystopia
plenty.
doesn't have to be post-apocalyptic,
Right.
but this book is
Yes,
post-apocalyptic
yes.
without any aspect of utopia to it.
Right. I've never considered it that the utopia has to be there for somewhere, but I like that idea. I genuinely like that.
I don't know. I've never actually Googled it. I just that
Right.
was just an assumption that I had to be.
The term itself, just I'm telling you right now, the term itself is just meant to be the opposite of utopia.
I
But
don't know what it means.
Okay, well, now I'm telling you, I guess.
Or like The Giver, it seems like utopia, but actually it's super messed up.
Sure.
And that's the dystopia aspect of it.
Right.
But there are some aspects of The Giver that are very, very appealing, right?
Yeah. Or it can also come down to a question of if a place is meant to be a utopia, because The Giver is meant to be a utopia for most individuals, but then there's like one or two that don't necessarily fall into that category. So before we get too far into the weeds, when we say necessity of utopia or opposite of utopia, I think we all know or can imagine what utopia is, right? Right? Perfect. We tend to imagine it now in our modern sensibilities as a perfect world, right? That's the term, how it's associated. Oh, this... I went to this spa and it was absolute utopia. It was wonderful. Everything to my benefit and the greatest massage on the planet. So I think some people are starting to know this, but the term itself doesn't necessarily imply perfection, but its original meaning, when it was first used way back when, the term was coined from Greek, it meant an impossible place or a place that doesn't exist. And because of that impossibility or that inexistence, people tended to hopefully imagine that as a perfect place by extension, right? Because perfection, by definition almost, is impossible to achieve, right? We can always lean towards it or get towards it, but you cannot get to it, right? Because it'll never be perfect for at least one person, for example. And so, regardless of how you consider its opposite, right, dystopia, whether it's a warped utopia, as in warped perfection, or the entire opposite of a utopia, which is to say hell, for example, or a hellscape. Think of 1984, for example, tends to be like touted as the pinnacle of a dystopian novel. Some of you, I don't know, do they still teach that in high school?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some people, yes, some people. I remember asking some students in Montreal about that. They were like, "No, we've never read it in their lives." So seems to come and go, I guess. Right. Cool. So, however you want to qualify dystopia, I think one of the things that makes it so powerful as far as young adult fiction is concerned and where it connects so often and overlaps so often with it is on this very idea that the place in utopia doesn't exist on this planet, right? And so we tend to imagine it in fantasy settings or science fiction settings. Whereas dystopias, you'll realize that they tend to be all too real. They often have this sense to them that, at least on some level, there is something that we can identify as similar to the world or the world that someone is experiencing, which arguably makes it much more powerful, right, in that sense. I like a lot of utopian fiction, but it does get boring very fast, right? Because if everything is perfect, you don't have a lot of conflict for your characters to go through. So as far as that fiction is concerned, not as worthwhile, but there are endless possibilities for stories that you can make in a world that seems similar to ours, but is just pushed to that breaking point where it's now terrifying for everyone, at least on some level. Now, extending this question further, why would these two often be associated together? Why would it be so compelling for young adult authors to put dystopias or to create dystopian worlds?
I think it just makes like the young adults like I think it's like depression, anxiety, like and stuff like that. Like it makes like their problems feel less smaller than the actually are. They grasp them or entices them or draws them into the.
Okay, so there was a lot said. So you said
it makes their problems feel smaller.
Makes their problems feel smaller. It's relatable. It drives them in. Right? Yeah, great. Those are all fantastic answers. Yeah.
I also think that young adults tend to be more dissatisfied
Yeah.
with the world.
Yeah.
More impulsive, like you said. And so this kind of thing, I think that this is the reason that Suzanne Collins wrote Hunger Games aimed at a young adult audience, because she wanted to make young adult people more politically aware of the world so that they would be angry and change things. Because it's the young people that tend to change things.
Yeah, definitely. So bringing all of this together, right? All of these excellent answers on a purely storytelling basis, right? It comes down to actually storytelling shorthand can be a very effective way of explaining this, right? If the young adult reader has some kind of grounding in reality, I don't have to explain as much about the world, and I can more easily, right, grab them in, as you were saying, Abube. And I can therefore make the actual action of the story front and center without having to get into the weeds of what the minutia of this world is. And usually that's what often suffers in young adult dystopian fiction, right, is the actual world building of it. Again, not always, but it is a thing that you see consistently. Right? Don't think about everything else too much, right? All that matters is that there's an evil person in power, and the young adult needs to fight the power. Okay? Great story. 10 out of 10. You've just got 9 novels out of that. Right? The reality of it, I think, to get on your 2 points, right? The reality of it also makes it, by definition, very relatable to the reader. And whether it actually works or not, I think part of the intention is also to get them to think about their position within the world, right? Which a lot of young adult fiction does try to do, right? To come back to the point on community. Right? How do you actually operate within the community around you, and why do you do that? Or how do you do that? Maybe it's by overthrowing a tyrannical government. Maybe it's by, I don't know, joining your local, book club or whatever. I don't know. This is an awful example, but you know what I mean, right? Whatever community means in the context of that story.
Isn't there a book called Reading Lolita in Tehran? That's basically that.
Is there really?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Of all the books, Lolita? I guess. Yeah. Yeah. We're not going to go down the Lolita rabbit hole. I was going to.
Well, I can
but
say a lot about Lolita.
Look, I like it, but not for those reasons. For those of you who have read Lolita or know about it.
She's an unreliable narrator.
Exactly. Okay. One of the advantages, I think, for dystopian fiction as well, not only is it relatable, but I guess extending from the relatability of it, it's often where you get some of the fresher topics in literature. That's not to say that you don't get that in other forms of fiction, of course. But the very basis of dystopian fiction as warping some kind of reality, right, that the author knows, makes it so that it's very apropos. Yeah, go ahead.
I've noticed in most dystopian fiction novels, they mostly have like this survival.
Survival is a big one now. Why would that be?
It's mostly centered on like monarchy, most of them, or like they're ruled by a born people.
Okay. So the rise in fiction that's centered around monarchies, I don't think it's a coincidence that it's happened within the last 10 years or so, right, when you're seeing a rise in totalitarian governments. The survival element that shows up in this novel, as well as many others, in the wake of climate catastrophes, which has forced a lot of people to reconsider how they live their lives, right, or imagine otherwise, because the actual event of an apocalypse seems more real now than ever. And to bring it back to the young adult thing, you're seeing a noted rise in depression among teens for that very reason, right? So all of those elements, I'm not going to write them down because I'm starting to lack space, but all of those elements make it so that it becomes much more interesting, and a lot of teens or even adults find that they're being spoken to right now. I think this is part of what science fiction writer Ursula K. Le Guin, who's fantastic if you wanted to read her. Not all dystopia is science fiction, but she did have a quote in an interview that she gave in the 70s. God damn it, I keep writing future. Where for her, this is one of the main reasons why science fiction is not about the future, but about the present. We're good? I don't know what just crashed. Oh, you crashed. Okay. I'm sure you can find a million examples, but the baseline, right, of science fiction for Le Guin, who was a very adept science fiction writer, was based in, right, what people are living right now. Actually, Le Guin's a really good example where now we consider her to be literary fiction, but when she was first publishing in the 60s and 70s, people often considered her and talked about her as a young adult writer. So that's a good example of how these.
Right, some that were specifically young.
Yeah, yes. There are some that are considered that still today you can see that, but yeah, like the Wizard of Earthsea, for example.
That one's interesting because she wrote it as a YA, but I would say that it's quite literary.
Exactly. Yeah. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I don't think Wizard would have been taught in universities, but that kind of change in sensibilities very much demonstrates what we're talking about here. Okay, so if you have any questions, now's the time. I'm happy to elaborate on this. I'm just looking at my notes to make sure I didn't forget anything. Cool. Any questions about any of this? What did I have next? We kind of talked about this a little bit. So yeah, the environment, we talked about it. And the setting overall is something that, as a concept, we discussed in previous classes. So very much post-apocalyptic. Yeah. Post-apocalyptic. What else did we say about the setting? So yeah, grounded in history. For us, it's certainly recognizable here in Canada, right? Even if we are in Manitoba, it takes place in Toronto and the north of Ontario. Right? So somewhat recognizable enough that I don't think anyone was disconcerted about the setting, so to speak. Right? So we'll put GTA and Northern Ontario.
Specifically in nature.
So Northern Ontario.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, it's important that most of the time they're not inside of a building.
Exactly. Except for one moment in the hotels. Sorry, someone else was going to say something? Yeah, go ahead.
I did say, like, I was listening.
Yeah.
It's not and also isolation and self-centered.
Oh, okay. So we'll add that on to the nature part. I like that. The idea of isolation can be a really interesting one to consider in the context of setting. The whole part we'll talk about in the theme part, but I don't even remember if I put it there, but I'll add on to it here just in case. Yeah, because you usually associate nature, especially in a post-apocalyptic setting, with isolation. And for a bit, I would say technically Frenchie, and especially at the start, Frenchie and his brother Mitch do feel somewhat isolated, even though they're not in nature, but they're in a torn down Toronto. But arguably, for most of the novel, even if they're in nature, they don't necessarily feel that sense of isolation. So there is a bit of a subversion of expectations in that notion. Did you also get that sense, or were you saying it because you actually did feel like they were isolated?
It was Because of everybody.
I think that they were isolated. I mean, he does touch on it a little bit too. The
Mhm.
fact that there's only 9 of them, and there's one girl that's dateable, I guess, at the beginning, and then as soon as Rose arrives, he's
Yeah.
like instantly like, because there's no chance for him to find a partner unless somebody comes into it, because they are just alone, the group of them in the
And
wilderness.
they're always running and hiding. And like,
So like, yeah, they're a family, but they are isolated. They're not in a large group. Like
Right.
we get to see people all the time.
Right.
Different
Good.
people.
So there's an isolation on the sense of the group size. That's true. I do agree with that. Like, I do think, I'll just finish my sentence and then, I do think, however, nature itself is never the source of isolation. Right? Maybe I can get some disagreement from that, but that's why I was writing subversion of expectation was for the nature and isolation part. But I think you're absolutely right that the group size definitely does lead to isolation in that sense, and it dissipates when they, spoilers for those of you who didn't get that far, but when they meet up with other groups. Yes, Billy.
I feel like nature, like, to them is huge because they're on the land and everything. So that's why I didn't really get the sense of isolation when they're in nature, because as indigenous people, like, being on the land is huge. But I feel like when they talk about groups, they're isolated, but then they do find that other group and they expand and they don't even relate it. But I feel like that's where they're isolated a bit, people could think, because it's not like you can just go back into the city and be like,
Yeah. We can, might as well mention it now because I don't know if we'll get back to it today, and it makes sense to talk about it now. But, right, the novel begins in Toronto, and Frenchie and Mitch are just the two of them, right? Their parents are already gone at that point. We get flashbacks, of course, but at that technical point in the novel, their parents are gone, and the only other people that they meet are recruiters, right? Which they hide from. So immediately, you're right. The urban setting of Toronto isolates, right? She never says it explicitly. At least I don't remember that in that first chapter or two. But yeah, I think it's not too much of a stretch to make that association. Right? Whereas once he joins the group, one of the first things they do is go up north into nature, and that's where. I'd have to find the exact passage. I highlighted it somewhere. If I remember, it's in the first third. Yeah, there you go, actually. So page 91, the very first chapter of Back in the Woods. There's even that mention at some point, in this time, in this place, the world had gone mad with lush and green, throwing vines over old electrical poles and belching up rotten pipelines from the ground. So the modernity and urban associated elements like electric poles are even being overtaken, right? And it is, it's in one of those moments, right? The Back in the Woods chapter, unless I'm misremembering it, actually is one of those community building moments where he learns a little bit more about everyone's backgrounds and the fact that Minerva is considered a kind of matriarch in the classical sense of the term, right? Even if not literally. So I think you're absolutely right on that one. Yeah, very good. Did someone else have their hand up? Were you just playing with your hair, Khalees? Is that why? Okay.
I have a thought. Actually, I was thinking about the fact that most stories, when you go into nature, nature ends up being a character on its own because it's man versus nature. And I didn't think about it until you said that actually, because it's from an indigenous perspective, it's just kind of taken for granted that they know what's up, and being in nature is not a problem at all. It's the other stuff.
So there's a whole debate, right, as to whether or not this can be considered like a stereotype, for example, of Indigenous people inherently being associated with nature. As I've mentioned in class before, it was definitely used rhetorically, right, against Indigenous people, right? that was the whole basis of the noble savage trope, right? Or stereotype. But when framed in a positive manner, and in what contemporary scholars refer to as a generative, right, situation, in which relationships, life, and so on is generated from these situations in a literal sense, then yeah, it can be extremely positive and go beyond the stereotype into something a little bit more fruitful. How many of you got to just to finish off on that point, the not Four Seasons, that's not the right one, the name of the hotel?
Anyway.
Four something? Four Winds?
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right, doesn't it? Right, that's one of the first things that that's discussed, is that how do they sleep together, right? Because they're so used to being in like a close-knit type of camping site situation, and then their first encounter with urbanity in that setting, this rather modern hotel, you can imagine a kind of Best Western or whatever, then suddenly they're like, how do we actually operate here? Do we all get our own rooms? This is kind of alienating in a big bad way. And I think that's one of the moments where I ended up smiling the most upon this reread, was the reveal at the end where they all just sleep in the same room together finally, right? Slowly but surely, they just all converged into that same room.
Except this guy. Oh, there he is.
Yeah, there he is, exactly. So yeah, that was cute, at the very least, and very much demonstrates exactly what we're talking about here. Good. I actually wasn't expecting to spend that long on this, but that's very good. Good job, everyone. Okay. Now, I put the premise here. Yeah, story so far. Did I put hope? Okay, no. I put it as part of dreams. Keep hope up so I can remember. All right. So, as far as just basic story is concerned, what would we say happens in the Marrow Thieves from what you've read so far? So we talked about chapter 1, right? Post-apocalyptic Toronto. So Toronto, like next year, probably. Let's meet up here in Toronto. But so post-apocalyptic Toronto. What else do we know about this world? Why is it post-apocalyptic? Do we know?
Climate disaster.
Yeah, it's never said like specifically what kind of climate disaster, but it seems to be like a cumulative thing. Right? So climate has gotten out of control, and basically everything collapsed. So good. What did that lead to? Once climate collapsed and society collapsed as we know it, what else happened, which is a main part of the story?
Coastlines all fell into the sea, and a bunch of cities were destroyed, and so now there's only a couple of cities left.
Okay, so there's a diminishing of urbanity.
And also it rains all the time, because all the ice caps melted, and that made it rain all the time.
I should be more specific. I'm trying not to be like super specific with my questions because I want to like see what you come up with. But
the loss of scientists. Is that one? They're one
so the science
residential schools. That's why.
There you go. So you're right. There is a lowering of urbanity, but also it's what explicitly gave rise to the main antagonism of the story of the residential schools, or the renewed residential schools, so to speak.
Curious
Um,
about that actually, because there's no reason for them to be called residential schools, but also it's just the indigenous main characters who are calling them residential schools. So it must be like a metaphor that they're just calling them that.
So they're not schools in the sense of the term, right? Even historical residential schools, at least on paper, claims to be teaching something, even if it was in a horrific manner. But I think you're right.
Like us saying
These-
Auschwitz is back, but it's not Auschwitz, but it's the same premise.
Right? It's basically a treatment camp of some kind. What do they do specifically in these quote unquote schools? What right actually comes down to the title of the text.
Getting rid of them.
Yeah. Okay, good. So it's a place where bone marrow is extracted for what purpose?
So that
It's mentioned at some point in
because white people
In-
can't dream anymore, and
Good.
so
so it's marrow / dream harvesting. Mig at some point explains that that's where dreams are stored, which is why they're harvesting it. So you have to kind of get on board with the premise. Is it entirely scientifically accurate? No. At least as far as I know about Marrow, as a non-scientific person, they do not store dreams. But as with a lot of speculative fiction, you just kind of have to embrace the premise of it and go along for the ride. Right? At the end of the day, you can say that it doesn't really matter. The point is what they're trying to say, right, with the story itself. Okay. Good. So this is all what we were talking about before, the basic premise, right? So when you say premise, it's the thing that is needed in order to get the story going. Okay. So the climate change led to the catastrophe, led to a rise in these schools, quote unquote, in order to harvest dreams, which have become all but impossible for most people in this world because the future has literally been canceled. Good. Within that context, you get the story of who's the main character? Frenchie, good. Who's named that way? Who's named that way because
he says tabernacle.
right, exactly, because he speaks French, and that hits at my heartstrings. Right, so he speaks French because he's Métis, right, and so his name is Frenchie, or his nickname, I should say, is Frenchie. And essentially, we can boil the story itself down to what goal? What is their purpose? What are they seeking to achieve? And you don't have to have finished the novel in order to know this. And I think this ties into why we could qualify this as a dystopia, no matter how you understand this.
Trying to escape north.
Trying to escape north? What's the promise of north? There's something that they're looking for up north. Better place. Yeah. Right? There are stories and legends and so on of this place that's supposedly better, right? It's where the community is. They have a name for it, Española. But their goal is, I'm going to put it in quotation marks, right? But that mythical no place. They don't know where it is exactly, they just know it's somewhere up north. And again, you see this kind of story all the time.
The Great Valley.
Great Valley, right? I don't think it's a coincidence that she calls it, or they use the term, when I say she, I mean Cherie Dimaline, but that Dimaline uses Española as a term at some point. The Spanish, when they were starting to go around, right? What's one of the first stories that came up is the story of El Dorado, right? This mountain of gold that's just beyond over there, right? Just a few more steps that way, right? And then we're going to be rich and powerful beyond our wildest dreams because we're going to find this mountain of gold. I'm using that as an example, but you see this type of story all the time, right? When Marco Polo went the other way around, right, in the 13th century, that was the whole point. Oh, great, there's this mythical land of spices. Later we'll call it China. But for now, it's just a mythical land of spices. So places can absolutely be goals, but usually in fiction, these places also have, right, metaphorical. I don't mind that you use your phones during class, but do you mind just putting it on vibration if possible? Yeah, I think that's it. So obviously we need like a colorful cast of characters in the process, which is par for the course with YA fiction. And that will become Frenchie's new family as they search for this place. Anything else we want to add about the story before we talk or we break down some of the themes that we think might be important for everyone to know? Going once, twice. Vanzu. So these are just some of the themes that I came up with. Oh yeah, I did. I am willing to talk about other things, of course, but these are the ones that I just kind of non-exhaustively put there that could be interesting to talk about, depending on how much time we have. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah, we're just basically going to keep talking about various aspects of this going forward. Maybe some of this is going to show up on the exam. Who's to say?
Gonna be on the exam like we should take a picture of this slide, or
anything that we talk about in class has the potential of being on the exam. I'll say that.
Come on, give us a little Easter egg.
I do have a story about that. I do have 2 questions related to the Marrow Thieves so far, but again, it depends on what we have time to talk about in class. One of them is a potential development question, and one of them's a passage identification. That is as much as I will give you. But again, we're going to have our last class is going to be a review class, so you'll have plenty of time to ask these questions. Okay, so yeah, might as well start with the dreams because we already put it up there and it's an integral part of the narrative itself. Just so I have room to write down, can I erase this part? Are we all good with that? Dreams, I think, are a rather complicated thing to discuss, generally speaking, but also even in this novel, I think it would be a disservice to say that dreams are demonstrated in a straightforward manner in Dimaline's text. There's the more obvious, right, and front and center version of dreams, right, as something that can be harvested like a drug, right, in being a counter to hopelessness. That's probably the one that we immediately went to, right? As far as metaphors are concerned, why are they harvesting dreams in Marrow? It's to be able to imagine a future, right? We no longer have a world as we once knew it, so might as well steal other people's dreams. Which ties in, I guess, to why they are called residential schools at all. Make explicit what I'm thinking. Why is it called residential? Why do they call them residential schools? Yes, there's the indigenous history part of it, but push that further. What's the metaphor there? Why bring that back if they're not technically schools?
If the residential schools were used for cultural and literal genocide, and these new buildings that they're putting up they're using them for genocide to harvest the indigenous people.
So even if the school part is not replicated in that sense, right, the purpose behind them is certainly being mirrored and echoed. So absolutely, that ties us. We're going to come back to that into the cyclical stories. And you can think of this on a metaphorical level of the mirroring and echoing that I was talking about earlier. In the case of the historical residential schools, the dreams of indigenous futurity and futures overall were canceled, right, in that sense, and genocided by encroaching colonialism. So you see that being repeated, of course. But in this case, there is double warping, if you want to say it in those terms. There probably is a better term to use. Insofar as the people running those schools, which seems to be basically anyone who's not indigenous, has already lost the ability to dream, right, and wants to recapture that because of that impossibility. Good. In what other circumstances do dreams appear?
Frenchie has dreams.
And you have that nightmare of his brother.
Good. So the types of dreams are important. One might add also types of dreams by who? So, of course, there's the bad dreams that we most often imagine, right? Nightmares, an easy literary shorthand for things are going bad and you want to imagine something else, right? You want to get into the realm of dreams rather than being stuck in the nightmare scenario. Right? So that makes a lot of sense. You were saying, right, the nightmares about his brother and so on. What other types of dreams does Frenchie have? Again, you won't need to have read that far to think of this. You can think of it both on the literal thing of dreams while you're sleeping, but also dreams as character motivation.
He has dreams of like protecting people and being strong for them.
Good. I'm not going to write this down just because it's a lot. But yeah, right. So there's the dream of being a protector, right? Classic of YA fiction in that sense. Young man dreams of being protector of the universe. Okay. we can argue till the cows come home as to whether or not that's a good idea, but this classic. Right? You can have also the dream of the goal, right? What does that look like? Extending from the goal, what does Frenchie dream of finding? He says this quite explicitly right at the beginning, or towards the beginning.
Does he dream of finding his father?
Yeah, I would say so. Even if it's not literalized in the sense of like something he imagines while he's sleeping, it's something that comes up over and over again, right? Adopted family, they're great and all. He, likes Mig, he likes the people around him, but his real dream is to find his dad again, right? His biological father, or his parents. Mostly father. Good. So dreams, again, are real and metaphorical. And one can think of whether or not that distinction is a valid one in the context of the novel. If something like Marrow can provide dreams, it might be because Dimaline is saying, well, maybe dreams are less immaterial than we like to think they are. Okay. We'll finish the dream point and then take a break, but who else is dreaming, or what other contexts are there dreams?
Something that they're looking for.
Okay, yeah, the hope, sure. So the hope of the better place, right? What other kind of hope is there?
There's the hope of like success or like them leaving and going back to interact.
Good, right? So there's the hope. I guess you can make it. Might seem like a facile answer, but success can be a very powerful motivator in the literal sense of the term. And every single chapter establishes a type of success or failure that the characters have to deal with. Right? I guess, spoiler for those of you who didn't get that far, when in the chapter, right, or in the section of the quote unquote other Indians, right, one of them kills Riri. Right? And so the success of protection that Frenchie is dreaming of is destroyed. Right? And what does he do to come back to the YA element?
Impulsive.
Yeah, he acts impulsively and kills the guy. Right? Hesitates for half a second and then shoots. Can maybe talk about that in relation to the failure of reconciliation point. Good. Do the non-Indigenous characters have their own dreams? The ones, say, who are running the residential schools, or the recruiters? I'm framing the question in this way because it's a nightmare for some, but I don't think it's fair to say that it's their nightmare either. What kind of dreams might the recruiters or the residential school runners have? If we think of this hypothetically, we can try to find some. It's a bit difficult to find some evidence in the text here just because we rarely get the perspective of the recruiters themselves, but
The recruiters are quite faceless. I mean, all non-Indigenous characters are quite faceless.
Yes.
but they do have goals, or else they wouldn't
Mhm.
be doing what they're doing. Their goal is to improve the lives of their own.
Good, right? On the basic sense, right, their dream is to reconstruct, right, what they once knew. Okay? And it's a dream in two senses. Okay? One, in the actual sense that the novel establishes, okay, of extracting marrow, okay, and being able to sleep well at night, okay? But also in the sense that it's almost an impossibility, like a lot of dreams. Right? Obviously, it's horrendous what they're doing, right? We shouldn't valorize it. That's not what I'm saying, right? When I say that they're dreaming of something. But in the most literal sense, what they're hoping to achieve has already passed, right? You can never turn back time, no matter how much you try. Right? And I don't think, even if it is, I guess, a science fiction or speculative fiction text, it would feel weird to involve like a time travel element to this, right? Of going back in time in that sense. It doesn't jive with the world that was created here. So the dream, again, is both physical and, right, imagining what could have been. Right? Can I go back to the way things once were and maybe do things differently? Then, of course, that becomes the nightmare of, right, the indigenous
I could
characters.
call back to the Handmaid's Tale.
Mhm.
I want to go back to like 1950s dream America.
Yeah. Of course, the joke of the Handmaid's Tale is that she wasn't using, she was using contemporary sources.
All real things that actually happened.
That she just like pulled things from the headlines as they were in like the mid-80s. So that dream was already real in some senses, right? Arguably much more horrifying. I don't know. No, that's a slippery slope. I don't want to compare horrors. That's a bad way of approaching things. Good. The body spirit thing we'll come back to in a sec. Yeah, I guess we already talked about desperation and hope, so we can address the reliance on history there. And by extension, some of the climate elements, and then take a break. So I want to chart something out here, and I don't have it in my notes, so I'm going to be kind of operating on the fly here. Please stop me if things get unclear, but I think there's an interesting way of thinking about the historical elements, the dream elements, and the extractive elements together. So we know that climate change led to the residential schools / marrow harvesting. Because there was a desire for dreams again. What's the great irony? Obviously, there's an irony on the sense of dreaming in order to perform a horror, right? So there's that contradiction in terms. Okay? But what other irony might we identify in trying to rebuild a certain past or a certain idea of past that is based off of extraction? And I don't think it's reading too much in this case into the text.
The extraction of labor,
Extraction of labor.
which is how we live our dream today.
Yeah. The beauty of the modern world, right, is that we've hyper-mechanized extraction, right? Last time we talked about this, I gave the example of Manitoba, right? You have, immense mining and oil production here, right? Logging as well. Like you have all kinds of extractive resources and companies operating here. And for some, right, that's what's fueling a dream of consumption, right? I can buy anything at any time, own a car, it's beautiful, right? Drive down the Trans-Canada Highway anytime I want, right? That is the American dream, right? It's being fueled in that sense. Right? If you manage to build, right, a new future in this hypothetical scenario on the backs of a literal extraction or a literalized extraction of someone's essence, right? Whether it's labor, dreams, bodies, which we'll come to, and nature, will that new future actually happen? No. You're repeating the cycle. Right? Which in a way, did I write it down? Oh crap, I think I erased it. Adds on to the element of the non-Indigenous characters or the enemies or the antagonists of the story lacking literal imagination, right? Literal dream. They cannot imagine otherwise, and so rely back on what they once knew, for better or worse. Mostly for worse. Actually, because it's a YA, it's all worse. I think it actually gets even more interesting because, as we talked about before, the use of Indigenous people or the imagination of Indigenous people as close to nature kind of amplifies this metaphor, right? So one could argue that the recruiters and the residential school people still rely on this notion or the stereotype of Indigenous people as one with nature in the negative sense, right? In order to make this whole thing justifiable. Again, here we have to read a little bit between the lines or rely on history, as I think the novel wants us to do, right? Dimaline wants us to think about history, because for me, that would be a criticism of the text. It is true that the antagonists are rather flat, right? You don't get a lot out of them. Which we can maybe think about why she does this. Maybe it's because of the limitations of the genre. Maybe she just didn't want to do it. I don't know. Right? But it could be a point of criticism, certainly. Any final points on dreams or dreaming before I let you take a break and then we come back to finish off whatever we finish off? Okay. Come back. 7:45 is good. Stretch your legs, get a coffee, do whatever. All right. We're ready to get back into the swing of things. All right. Whether you've read the entire story or not, is there a passage in particular that stands out to anyone that's worthy of unpacking or discussing? And maybe we can talk about some of those things by extension, but I think I have in mind otherwise a passage that could work for a few of them, but I'm opening it up to the floor, seeing if anyone wants to discuss a particular section, just to have you engage a little bit. While I find the passage that I was
There's something that I would like to discuss.
Mhm.
It's not a passage per se, but the concept of Minerva sort of gatekeeping her language
Yep.
and only teaching them one word at a time here and there. But then her language of dreaming was so powerful that it blew up the machine, but she was gatekeeping it. Like,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah. So I'll write down the bare bones of what you said here. Minerva as okay, and then you mentioned the the school, right? Okay.
I suppose she couldn't have known that was going to happen, but she spends all this time with them, and she just doesn't share.
Yeah, so I guess we can start off with the question of why does she keep the language or the stories to herself? Because for all intents and purposes, she's the last bastion, right? That she's the person who would have remembered the stories, remembered the language, and why not share the wealth in that sense? Go full story communism, right? It's a stupid way of putting it.
Yes.
Right, but why not share the wealth of stories and the interest? I think part of the answer
Is it fair to say
lies.
that she probably would have after she realized how powerful it was?
Okay, right. So there's a question of power, although I have a sense that she already knew what the power was, but I think you're more on the money with the idea that she didn't expect to necessarily die, right, or get captured so quickly, which, in my reading, means that she's the most hopeful character up until the very end when Frenchie kind of unlocks the hope package. Because I think her inherent and intrinsic hope leaves her to assume that she's going to have all the time in the world in order to tell those stories. Whereas if you compare to someone like Mig, right, he's also a storyteller. He tells story part 1 and part 2, and presumably on and on. Right? But he's a much less hopeful character, right? He's a much more rational or realistic character in that sense. And so he's willing to share, right, because, for the sake of knowledge. He seems to have a bit more of a pragmatic awareness that he might die any day.
Which is very strange because Minerva loses a baby, they say, one of the kids, and yet that doesn't seem to faze her. I mean, it phases her in that she wants to give them medicine to take care of them, but she doesn't want to pass on knowledge to them.
Right.
But she doesn't feel like she's at risk.
Either she's not at risk, and again, I think it comes down to the difference between how Frenchie and Rose address her. I think there's a bit of a secret in there. It's never explicitly mentioned, but this is a kind of running theory that I have. What's the difference between how Frenchie and Rose address or think of Minerva, especially when Frenchie first meets Minerva? Okay, I might have to tell you that one. So
Frenchie doesn't want to get left behind in the camp with Minerva. He wants to be out with me learning survival skills, and so he kind of looks down on people who are in
Yes.
the camp doing the homesteader stuff.
Right. There's an inherent lack of respect. Right. Frenchie, his whole idea, and we mentioned this before, and I don't think it's one that Dimaline is uncritical of, is to be a protector, right? And for him, what that means is going out and hunt, right? Be a man's man, right? As no one should say. But, right, but in that sense of traditional masculinity, of going out to hunt, survival, that type of stuff. And so when he's left behind with Minerva, his first instinct is, oh, damn it, I'm staying with this old bag, right? So, whereas Rose has the complete opposite reaction. She respects what Minerva stands for, and therefore she's the person that Minerva starts to actually tell the stories to. So one could argue that it is a bit of a foolhardy scenario considering the world in which they live, in which you could die at any point. But one could also argue that the respect for the story gives it power. Now, is it actually real? To come back to your original query, right? Does she actually know the power of the story, or so on and so forth? That's up to you, right? At the end of the day, that burning down of the residential school is itself a story that's told within the narrative. Do we know if it actually happened in that exact way? Maybe she just lit a match, right? Maybe there was a faulty electric wire. Maybe this is a world in which stories are so powerful that it overrides what the residential schools represent. Right? You can think of it on a more metaphorical level. Is it a bit of an unsatisfying answer? I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting to think about it. I think the novel, the way it's set up, reinforces the idea that the metaphor is real. That even if it didn't happen exactly as is stated, I'd have to find the exact passage where they talk about it, but the miracle of Minerva, right? For those of you who want to know what we're referencing, this is on page 171, the miracle of Minerva. There's a whole section in which there's a story being told that Minerva was singing and recounting stories in her language, and it ignited a fire in the residential school that she was being kept in. If there's anything, I guess, that you can learn from contemporary literature, or literature more broadly, it's that stories do have power. Right? And Dimaline is taking that literally. I don't know. I'm genuinely curious. Do we find that satisfying as an answer? Or do we find that a bit of a cop-out? Or cheap in that sense? Right? How do we feel about an answer like this? Or that idea that stories have so much power that they will burn down the system?
I think it's good. I agree.
Anyone disagree? Anyone find it sucks? Good. Don't need to argue that one. All right. Was there anything else I wanted to add on that? There's a level on which the story being told about Minerva, no one can fact check it anyway, right? Because that's just not the world that they live in, of course. And Minerva dies anyway. She gets shot. so it doesn't. It can't be fact checked. So all they have, whether they want to or not, is the story. Comes back to what we were talking about in previous classes, right? On what the nature of history is, and that history in itself is a story that we tell ourselves. It's just for us to decide whether or not where that history delves into the realm of fiction. Every time I use the word delve now, I can't help but think that people sound more and more like AI because it overuses delve, and I hate that. Right? I can no longer use delve neutrally anymore.
I didn't know that yet. Just said.
Yeah, so that's one of the ticks for artificial intelligence writing, is that it overuses certain verbs like delve. And part of the reason why they think that is because a lot of the training for artificial intelligence takes place in Nigeria, for example, where linguistically and locally they do use delve more often, and so the AI just kind of adapted to that type of dialect.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
What did I originally use this for? I know a lot of teenagers don't have access to it.
No, like there's a lot of data centers and training centers in Nigeria, and so they literally hire people to train artificial intelligences, and they're trained on dialectical and locally specific forms of English or whatever language. So you can kind of identify where the training centers are through that. Yeah.
It's not for like scamming people?
I mean, probably, because AI is a scam, but on that level. Yeah. Anyway, that was the AI segment of the class. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. There was a... Yeah. On page 172, just to go off of this bit. So yeah, just a page into the Miracle of Minerva. There's a section that states, as it turns out, every dream Minerva had ever dreamed was in the language. It was her gift, her secret, her plan. She'd collected the dreams like bright beads on a string of nights that wound around her each day, every day until this one. The wire sparked, the probes malfunctioned, bodies rushed around the room in a flurry of black robes like frantic wings beating against mechanics. The system failed all the way through the complication of mechanics and computers, burning each one down like the pop and sizzle of a string of Christmas lights, shuddered to ruin one by one. So, to come back to the idea of keeper, right, one can also add to the idea that having a repository of knowledge is a powerful statement in and of itself, right? Being able to say that you hold a particular knowledge or a particular ideal or a particular community, right, linguistically speaking, in yourself is a source of extreme power. Obviously here it's metaphorical, but it is played out in the novel on a physical level and literal level instead. If you turn to the last page, not last page, 206, oh damn.
Can you please tell me?
Yeah, hold on. I'm just trying to find where it was. I thought I had highlighted it. Yes, here we go. So it's 214, which is chapter QM. Those of you who have the digital editions, I'm sure it's the same pages-ish. There's a paragraph that starts, the council spent a lot of time piecing together the few words and images each of us carried. If you have the digital copy, you can look for that. So, towards the end of the novel, at the point where they're constructing hope, right, or a hopeful future. Now that council is together, everyone who will die in the narrative has already died, right? There's nowhere to go but up from a narrative sense. This is where they state this, reinforcing what Minerva was saying. The council spent a lot of time piecing together the few words and images each of us carried. Hello and goodbye in Cree, a story about a girl named Sedna, so Inuit, whose fingers made all the animals of the north. They wrote what they could, drew pictures, and made the camp recite what was known for sure. It was Bullett's idea to start a youth council, to start passing on the teachings right away, while they were still relearning themselves. Slopper was tasked, what a name, Slopper was tasked with putting that together, and he thrived under the responsibility. He even gave them a name, Miigwech, feathers. We were desperate to craft more keys, to shape the kind, to give shape to the kind of Indians who could not be robbed. It was hard, desperate work. We had to be careful. There's a typo here. We weren't making things up, half remembered, half dreamed. We felt inadequate. We felt hollow in places, and at certain hours, we didn't have names in our language. So my misreading of certain typos aside, if anything, this is kind of the thesis of the novel stated at the end, which seems counterintuitive. In the past few weeks, we've been looking at the start of the novels for those identifications, or even at the middle, which you could arguably do as well in this one. But I think it's a really good choice on Dimaline's perspective to wait till the end in order to do that. Because even in a dystopian world, you can still go down further, right? That is arguably what a dystopian world offers, is the possibility of going further and further into chaos or hell or whatever you want to qualify. And so to use the ending, which is typically associated with hope or the ending of a certain narrative in order to make this claim about stories, right, is, I think, a good narrative choice on her part. And I just really like the sentence, we were desperate to craft more keys to give shape to the kind of Indians who could not be robbed. What do we make of a sentence like that? Why is that? Why would I find it so powerful?
Like language keys?
Language keys?
The actual keys that they gave. And there was a code. And there was some classes that there was.
Okay. Right. So what's the relation with keys here?
It was called.
Oh, really? Oh, interesting. Okay. So there's a play on that, right? So unlocking language, what else might we be unlocking then with keys? Freedom.
Culture and community?
Yeah. New pathways, but in this case, quite literally, right? Opening doors towards new possibilities. Right? If there's one thing that YA fiction does well, is that it removes a lot of interpretability, which is maybe to its disservice, but it makes an English class much easier, at least for where I'm concerned. But I also like the idea, right, of Indians who could not be robbed. So in previous generations, and this is what we were talking about before, language had been robbed, right? That was the whole point of the residential schools. I mean, to remove the language, steal it from them so that they could no longer have it. Right? So the point is now not just to recover, to come back to the chart that I had given just before the break. Right? It's not to recover a past that can no longer be, right? But to inspire yourself from that past and build something new out of it, right? That's why they're talking about new languages, right? They're mixing all kinds of cultures here, Inuit, Cree, etc. Which on the one hand can have a tendency to flatten out, but I think the intention here, at least the way that they're framing it in the novel, is to open up the possibilities of new ways of telling stories and new ways of language that is no longer as containable. And I think that's pretty neat. It's also really interesting. I just clicked on this, that the two examples that she gives are the two examples that we were talking about last week with the syllabary. Do you remember that? Right, when we were talking about the writing that had been created by missionaries in order to create a written version of Cree and Inuit, right? And it's interesting that she then uses Cree and Inuit cultures in order to talk about the recreation of language in that specific moment. I don't know to what extent it was intentional. I've never seen her speak to that particular passage, but it's an interesting thought experiment. And like the whole creation of languages that's redone from something that had been imposed, arguably, on to a certain extent. It's okay if you have nothing to say on that. This is just me going off on a tangent that I think is maybe worth an essay point. Okay. How many of you got to the Rougarou section where Minerva tells that story? Well, those of you who finished it if you got through most of it, you'll have seen it at the more towards the beginning. She tells a story about the Rougarou, which is a Métis word for werewolf, basically. It comes from the French loup-garou. So for those of you who are looking, if anyone has the actual chapter on their mind, they can tell me, but I will be looking for it. Rogarou. Rougarou, basically.
It's at the 4 Winds chapter.
Okay.
And the audio is 360.
62.
4 Winds chapter.
Okay, so the 4 Winds chapter. Okay.
And then if you scroll up.
Yeah, let me just scroll through this book.
5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. You can scroll like 12, 13.
Oh, got it. Yep. So 66 for the people who are following on the physical book. And it's the section that starts, if you're searching for it. This is my comrade's story, told to me when me and my sisters were turning into women. It's about the Rougarou, the dog that hunts the half-breeds, but keeps the girls from going on the roads at night where the men travel. It's like a fairy tale, right? A cautionary tale. Does anyone want to read that section?
Sure. If you want me to read from Princess from 4,
Start by down by the river. Start where the actual story starts.
Okay.
And I'll stop you because we're not going to read the entire thing, but I'll stop you at some point.
Okay. Down by the river to draw water, I feel eyes at the back of small and broad of his stomach, sweet grass type of it. I stand and turn fast, already drunk and stood against the back of me, thinking like a dagger. But now the Rougarou is watching. The Rougarou, and yes, Rougarou. I I know him when I see it. Too big to be a dog. Black as pitch. Eyes yellow as moon round. I tried to ignore him, turn my back even, but still, I hear him repeating. Now panting like a big dog. Just slow winds and owls like a calm everyday man. So I turn again, this time raising my arms to the feet. The sweat, the sweet grass falls all around my feet, I remember. I can smell it being strong, even over the stench. I growl, a throat sound no it. He looks up at my hands and then stands on all smooth like smoke in the coldness out, all air.
All right. We'll stop there. Why would it be important for Minerva to tell that story at that moment? So they've just arrived into the hotel. They're sitting down, and she's telling a story about a dog, half man thing that, when she says haunts the half-breed, she's referring to Métis people. Right? That's what that reference is. So why would that story be important then? Okay, good. So on the one hand, it's pretty clearly a cautionary tale. Good, but warn of what? Because on the surface, it's a story of don't talk to strangers, right? You can take it in that literal sense, which makes sense considering what we've read about stories like Split Tooth, right? And Tagak's experience. Don't talk to weird creepy men in the forest, right? But does that fit in with the novel? Maybe for Wobb's story, but overall, right, it's not the main thrust of the novel necessarily. So why?
Things are not how they seem.
Okay, good. Things are not as they seem. Awesome. Okay. You looked like you were going to say something else. Okay. How does the story end? Do we remember?
The overall book.
No, the Rokaru story.
I just remember that it gets scary and they have some of the kids away, right?
Yes, so it does get scary. It ends basically where they it starts with that violence and ends with that scene, my gut on the other kind of violence. He comes as beast and I make him bleed, right? So there's this kind of reversal. And there's a violence in which they kind of encounter one another, right? And it becomes a metaphor for sexuality in this case, right? Because then there's the whole association. I am damned because my sin is my family's sin, and so on and so forth. So there's the implication that they get together, but also that that the Rougarou was defeated, right? In the sense of actually enacting some kind of violence. Again, when I bring the blood, he brings the man, and Mother and Kamak are all erased, and Catholic are all erased, and I am just a woman. I think he can just, And he talks, I'm marked, talk to the old man there down at the shore, and he talks about Rougarous. I don't ask, I think he can just tell. He says they kill unless met without fear. He sends ones who are marked, that dog will keep coming back. He says, even when you are on your deathbed, he will come. So she's marked and cursed forever. It's a cautionary tale, we know that. It's one of those instances in storytelling where it's a foreshadowing that I guess makes sense in the content only after the fact. I think there's one here. There's one here that's quite clear, I think, and another one that's maybe a little bit more tenuous as far as our themes are concerned. So Minerva herself, what happens to her? We've addressed it, right? She's captured by the recruiters, right, in the barn, taken to her school, and shot eventually, right, due to other circumstances. So on the one hand, right, it is foreshadowing of Minerva's own tale, right, being marked for death. Right? It cannot escape her, in part because she has the stories. Okay? But notice that the story itself doesn't actually come from a place of fear. Right? It scares the children, but the way that Minerva seems to recount it doesn't seem to be actually terrified. Right? And I think that's part of what you were talking about, Mel, earlier, about finding that whole situation a little bit difficult. I think part of it comes from that. Right? She doesn't seem to fear whatever is out there. Right? And even when she's captured by the recruiters a little bit later in the chapter, not that chapter, but another one. Rougarou comes hunting, is that it? Where she gets captured? Right, but anyway, when she gets captured in the barn, right, she doesn't actually fight back. She does what the Rougarou story expresses, which is meet them without fear. Right? She sits down, everyone stops, right, and she's taken in a rather self-sacrificing way.
Just like Max.
Just like what?
The Hunger Games.
Oh, okay. Yes, just like that character in the Hunger Games. But again, it is an often very YA trope, right? I'll sacrifice myself for the great love of my life or whatever, right? For the greater good. And again, when we were talking last week about the aesthetics of violence, this whole idea of sacrifice is really something that can take a negative spin, because this is fascism 101, right? Embrace death. Right? That's literally what the whole ideology is about. But in this case, it's not embracing death for the sake of death or for glory. It's sacrificing yourself for others to survive, in this case. It's maybe a bit more of a ham-fisted transition, but it does get at least on some level, this failure of reconciliation point as well. Right? Two totally different peoples come together. One of them is met with violence, the other is met with open arms, and it doesn't actually lead to anything productive, right? If we want to make a historical mirror in that sense. Which is a very cynical take on, right, the potential of reconciliation, but unfortunately history bears that one out a little bit too well for all kinds of situations. How many peace treaties have been signed over the course of decades to little avail. Actually, no, I don't know why I did this. What, I guess, what other points in the novel point to this reconciliation and sacrifice point? So one of them we said is, oh shit, the Rougarou story. Minerva. Anything else that we can think of? Yeah. Okay, yeah, good. The novel literally starts with a form of sacrifice? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Good. So, arguably, if you want to think of it in structural terms, it's the foundation of the story. Who else faces this? I'm thinking
Isaac?
say more. How does Isaac
They're
represent
caught
this?
in the house, and then Isaac tells them to go, right? And then he'll stay, but then they don't. They both get captured. And then Meg manages to escape, and then he goes back for Isaac, but he can't bring himself to, and then he thinks Isaac's dead, so he gives up.
Right. Good. So, but Isaac says something really interesting that also ties into this. When
he says that they're reasonable people, and we can talk to them, because he doesn't believe that anybody would do what they're actually doing.
Exactly.
Has hope for the wedding.
Yeah. Isaac has hope for reconciliation in this case, right? On the literal sense. I'm just looking for that passage. What do you mean we gotta run? This is our home. We don't have to. There we go. It's on page 106 for people who are following along. Isaac, just leave the bags. Get your shoes on now. Layer up as much as you can. Hurry. I pushed him away from the window. Me, it's too late. If I can just talk to them, I'm sure. Cuts off. They won't listen. You need to get ready to leave right this minute. I watched half the men circle to the back. We'd have a shot if we got to the cellar and came up into the yard. It wasn't a guarantee with all these men, but it was the best chance we had. Right, so Isaac has faith in conversation. Which I'm not going to stand here and say, right, conversation never works, right? Obviously, there are situations in which violence doesn't solve the issue. Right? That's not what I think either Dimaline or myself would say in this situation. But when you're addressing people who are acting out of desperation, right, or a perceived sense of desperation, it becomes very difficult to actually engage, right, with any kind of reason, to use your term, or rationality. Does the novel, I guess, bear that out, would be my question. Does it confirm this?
That the situation is impossible?
Right? That it's impossible to actually do anything but violence in a situation of despair.
Well, it's not an act of violence to build a community in the north.
Right.
Although whether that's going to be successful or not is to be seen.
Right. There is technically a sequel to this.
Is there?
Yeah, Empire of the Wild, I think. It says it's called a Marrow Thieves story, so it takes place in that same world, but I don't know if it's the same characters that continue, so might want to check that one out if you feel like it. If we just rely on the novel itself as it's presented to us, right, I think on some level the fact that it ends on a hopeful note does indicate this whole idea that it does encourage this perspective that nonviolence is possible, but under certain circumstances. Okay. Isaac managed to move the room in Minerva. Anything else that we are missing here as far as sacrifice or reconciliation is concerned? Just to finish off on this, the fact that it is a coming of age story, I think, does get to this reading, right? That ultimately you shouldn't rely on despair. Right? Because Frenchie, as the main character, his first instinct as a young adult who's acting on emotion is to despair. Right? When Riri dies, his first act is an act of desperation in shooting the man, right, who kills her. When Minerva dies, or is captured, his first instinct out of despair is to want to go and find her alone. Right? And everyone around him in the story constantly reminds him, no, if you do that, you will die. Right? So even if we don't, if we have perhaps issues with the way that it's addressed, that's fine. I think the novel does encourage this idea that something beyond despair and something like conversation in certain circumstances and peace is possible at the very least. It's that coexist bumper sticker, right, that you see on cars sometimes. Again, references for nobody. There's a church on my street that has that. It's a bold move. It's a good move. No, I like it.
What kind of a church is it?
It's like I think it's an Orthodox church. I'm actually not sure. Yeah. I have a feeling we're only going to spend today's class on this novel, considering not only your reactions to it, or just like your enthusiasm now, but also just like how quickly we're managing to get through this. The last question I guess I had, which ties in most explicitly to the topic of genre, is the idea of the coming to stories, which are recurrent in the novel. Frenchie has a coming to story. Who else has one? Wab has a coming to story. Mig has a coming to story. And am I missing one? I think it's just that. You get background for other characters, but they're not like a formalized story. And you get Mig's capital S story in 2 parts. Is there a conversation or is there an answer to be had in what Dimaline is doing as far as creating a coming of age story for Frenchie and constantly coming back to the coming to stories, right? How might we distinguish between coming to stories and more broadly a coming of age story? Does this question make sense? Billy's like, no, not at all.
Coming to is like how they came to the group, right? Although Wobbs doesn't really communicate that.
Nope. So it's often related to the group, but I wouldn't say that it's quite explicitly about that. So coming of age story, we talked about it, right? It's actually reaching your goal as a young adult, right? That making that transition towards
no, it does
from adult
tell
to
her coming to the group. Because it's like how she gets cast out and she's on her own,
True.
And then she finds these people.
That's true.
So it is all coming to the group.
How does her story? Right. Okay. Well, it's implied. Yeah. At the end, when I could walk, I did 1 block, then another, then a field, past a line of trees, and into the bush. Gone. And the dick who set up the run, who handed over the danishes and scurried off into the alleyways. That was the man I saw a week ago in the woods. I'm sure of it. Right?
So I guess
So,
it's just her coming to the bush.
Exactly.
How they all came to the wilderness.
Good. How they all came to the wilderness, right? Or to nature in that sense. Miggs ends with Isaac being gone and him having to go into the north, right, in order to find him or to reach his goals. Frenchie's ends with him falling unconscious from lack of nutrition and being found by the group and taken into the north, right, outside of the Greater Toronto area. So arguably the coming two stories, if you want to put it in that sense, how did I put it actually? Just to make sure that I'm on the same path as I was yesterday. Yeah. If you want to put it in the terms that we've been talking about in this class, even if they're not physically at the beginning, they are each of those characters, right, beginnings, whether they're in the middle, the end. Most of them are in the first half, right? If not all of them are in the first half. Whereas coming of age is both the ending or the feeling of ending, as well as, yeah, no, I guess it's the same thing in some sense. The abstract version of the goal, right? The physical version of the goal is the community that they find in the north, whereas the abstract version of it is the end point or the coming of age. So Frenchie is, of course, the main character, and he's the one who most explicitly faces a coming of age, and goes through that coming of age, and losing people around him and coming out better at the end, once he finds his dad and so on. Is there anyone else in the story that goes through a coming of age kind of transition, would we say? Aside from Frenchie. Obviously, this question only applies to like the three people who read the entirety of the book.
Let's get their names on this. Like the one guy decided like he found Isaac and he stayed back and like instead of going out hunting, right? Is that kind of the story?
The guy who stayed back.
I have a PDF, but it takes me a while to go
Yeah.
so I know it's something like that. Just seems recent.
You're not talking about Clarence? No.
Or maybe.
Maybe. So the coming of age usually applies to the children or the actual young adults, right? Because otherwise we would just call every character development a coming of age, so to speak, which is perhaps fair, right? Yeah.
Nick.
Oh, Meg, yeah, okay.
Nick
That was the other answer I was
Yeah,
looking
that's
for.
what Nick was looking for. He was going to join it,
Yeah,
and
okay.
he decided to stay back with the dad. And so instead of like going on with that,
Yeah.
that's it.
The only problem exactly is that he goes through a full arc, right? In literary terms, because he's not a youth, right? He wouldn't necessarily go through a coming of age, so to speak, but he follows a similar trajectory, right? Of loss and recovery that Frenchie does. The major difference is that his purpose in the narrative is to mirror how an adult would actually do it. Arguably, Rose goes through her own coming of age, right? Although she she does in a sense, although her role is inevitably downplayed by the fact that Frenchie's the main character. But no, similarly, she learns the power of community. Okay.
And the friends we made along the way.
No, but literally, though, it is the friends we made along the way. Yeah. I don't. I know we say that as a joke, almost, right? It's about the friends we made along the way, but there's a lot of narratives that are exactly about that. Right? It's not that much of a stretch.
Look at Gimli and Legolas.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The Lord of the Rings is just that. It's 6 times as long as the Marrow Thieves and is basically the friends we made along the way. And that's beautiful. Okay. I know we have like 20 minutes left here. Do we have any like final points or questions? Did we like this? Did we not like this? This is the first time I teach this in a university setting.
It's better than the worst.
Really? Wow.
I could have finished that book.
Wow. Okay. I would. Okay. Well. Okay. That's absolutely your. I'm genuinely surprised, but okay. Why? Why is this better than the wars?
I don't the whole writing for me and like the storyline is more.
Right. Okay. So on the level of the storytelling, it felt a little bit more appropriate.
I think I just prefer this topic.
Okay.
Honestly.
That's entirely fair.
I just can never connect to history and all like not history like to the wars, like, you know what I mean? But
Is
like,
this not history?
but, like
as well?
I guess more so like military and like that's more guns and stuff.
Sure.
This is
Yeah.
not
The
fun.
boy's own adventure
Yeah.
is less your speed.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Billy?
Yeah, like I feel like you can kind of go with this one because
Mhm.
like it's more about nature and
Sure.
It's really descriptive. Like,
Yeah.
I can really like place myself, picture this in my head, and they even talk
Mhm.
about the forests. It's like
and like imagine where they were out there on the land. Where like I feel like in the wars I can't imagine we ever
I just imagine
being on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Like, and I'm also not as like
Mhm.
I don't connect.
No, it's fair. One of the things we've parsed out throughout this class, even if tangentially, is she deliberately wrote this YA fiction, right? In order to be accessible. One could also think of why Findlay wrote in that specific way, because he has written novels that are closer, never YA, so to speak, but he has written novels closer to more conventional narratives that we might expect, right, or more linear. Right? We don't have to answer this question now because it's almost 9:00, but it is worth considering again, like why he would have chosen to write in that way. Right? You don't again have to like that, but it is worth thinking about. Right? But yeah, I do. Coming back to it, I was genuinely surprised by how many lines I was like, actually, that's a pretty good line, right? Like, I think after our discussion, I think I do agree that I prefer Tanya Tagaq's prose style, but I do like her writing genuinely. At points, it really does. It really is evocative to your points. How about you, Brittany? How do you feel about this from what you've read?
I agree with them. I liked it better than the wars. It seemed easier to.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't reading it, I was listening.
It's look, storytelling, whether it's read or listened to, is storytelling. Actually, that's a good question. Did it listen well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's...
I listened to some of it too, and
Yeah.
it was nice to hear the language spoken.
Yes. I think that's probably... I wouldn't be surprised if it shined more as an audiobook.
I also feel like I followed a lot with the book as well.
Mhm.
So it's like just hearing it, I feel like I comprehended it a little
Yeah.
easier.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the language, that would definitely make sense because there are some things that I wouldn't know necessarily how to pronounce it unless I looked it up, which stops the flow of the story. But also, there are some writers that have that sense of storytelling as if you're just recounting it to someone. Right? There is, of course, as we've talked about before, a long history of Indigenous peoples doing that. But I feel that other authors do that really well as well. I was surprised by this. I listened to a Margaret Atwood audiobook. I listened to Alias Grace on audiobook, and it really ripped. Right? Like, it was really good. And I preferred it to the actual reading of the novel itself. It just had that quality to it that sounded better when it was spoken. Right? So I think that's absolutely a valid, I wouldn't say criticism necessarily, but a valid comment for sure.
What did you like the like red?
Yeah, my personal favorite is Findlay, but I also have I really like all the texts that we've talked about. There's a reason why I talk about them in class. Part of it is just because I enjoy these stories, right? There's a special place in my heart for Findlay. I like him as a writer in an even beyond the wars. So yeah, for me, I find him particularly powerful. But to Gale's and Dimaline's credit, these are the only works that I've read of them. So I would be curious to read other texts outside of them and see if I also enjoy their other works as much. Yeah. That's my long-winded answer.
You like the wars?
But
War?
I'm not a huge war guy. I'm not one of those weird people that as soon as they hit 30, they become obsessed with World War II. No, I just like the stories that he tells. Aside from the war, right? Just before I arrived here, I picked up an old copy of Findlay's novel Pilgrim. Actually, a signed copy of that novel that I found at a secondhand bookstore, so I was really excited about that, and I had to leave. But yeah, it's just the actual stories that he tells about both historical figures and just parsing out these minutiae of literary detail and making a whole story out of it is, I think, really a skill that very few authors have that I find admirable. Ayad or Mel, anything to add about this? Like, dislike, okay? I know you were okay on it, but unless you've changed your mind on it.
Oh, I don't like it.
You didn't like it at all. Did the discussion today change any of that?
A little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit.
In what sense? I'm just curious again.
I do think that there's an aspect of Indigenous storytelling being different to what I'm used to with storytelling. I very much like this feels like a beginning, this feels like a middle, this feels like an end. With stories, I like to be introduced to the characters in the first act to the point where I care about the characters.
Yes.
So that when things happen in the second act, like Riri dying, I didn't really care because her whole personality is just annoying little kid. And I understand that it's important to Frenchie.
Sure.
But I didn't feel that at all.
You as the reader
as the reader, I didn't get attached to her, or I didn't empathize with Frenchie for his feelings because I didn't feel like his character was written in a compelling enough way that I would feel that. I felt more for the main character of the wars losing his sister in the first couple pages than I did about Riri dying because I don't know.
Yeah,
I wasn't invested in the characters in the same way.
I would agree with that. I think the characters are less interesting than the themes and the events that are trying to be demonstrated.
And for me, what I want out of a book is characters that I find compelling.
That's fair. I think that's a totally fair criticism. Yeah. Aya, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I perhaps didn't really read much of the book itself, but yeah, I would say that if you do read the book eventually, it could be a bit interesting to learn more about.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
All right. That means, yeah, I don't think. Are we okay with us moving on from this novel tomorrow? I don't think there's anything else that I would say about it. Unless we talk for 3 hours about where we expected it to end. But I think that would be pushing it even for me. Okay. So that means tomorrow. So we have 2 things left to read. Let me pull it up. If I'm not mistaken, it's Obasan tomorrow and Dion Brand's inventory on Thursday. Wednesday. If anyone has the syllabus in front of them, they can confirm. But
Sounds right.
that sounds right to me.
And then Thursday's a review.
Yes, and Thursday's a review. If we're okay with that. Okay, I'm just pulling it up here. Here we go. Yeah, so Monday, Marrow Thieves. Tuesday, yeah. So I already put an excerpt up of Obasan by Joey Kagawa. I think I put the first 4 chapters, but it's like 20 pages or so of the text. If you want to read more, it's fantastic. But there's enough, I think, to unpack for a whole class there. And then I think Dion Brand is a good place to end, as she brings together a lot of contemporary sensibilities in a way that will allow us to bring a lot of the course's themes to a close. Yeah. Any questions? Okay. I will see you tomorrow.